This conviction has led me from the beginning of my ministry to advocate at different levels the global abolition of the death penalty.
First of all, Mr. Otero was strangled, or a bag put over his head and strangled. Then I thought he was going down, and I went over and strangled Mrs. Otero. I thought she was down. Then I strangled Josephine, thought she was down, and then I went over to Junior and put the bag on his head. After that, Mrs. Otero woke back up, and she was pretty upset and what's going on. So I came back, and at that point in time, strangled her for the death strangle at that time.
With your hands or what?
No, with a cord, with a rope. And then I think at that point in time, I redid Mr. Otero, put the bag over his head, went over, and then took Junior. Before that, she asked me to save her son. So I actually had taken the bag off, and then I was really upset at that point in time. So basically, when Mr. Otero was down, Mrs. Otero was down, I went ahead and took Junior, I put another bag over his head and took him to the other bedroom at that time.
What did you do then?
Put a bag over his head, I put a cloth over his head, a T-shirt and a bag so he couldn't tear a hole in it. And he subsequently died from that. And then when I went back, Josephine had woke back up.
What did you do then?
And I took her to the basement and eventually hung her.
All right, you hung her in the basement?
Yes, sir.
All right, did you do anything else at that time?
Yes, I had some sexual fantasies.
But we also need to work through our legislative process to contact our legislators, both state and federal legislators, our state representatives and federal representatives, to work to abolish the death penalty. I mean, this is what the Holy Father, and I think rightly, is suggesting, that in the modern world, especially in developed countries, that the death penalty no longer serves the purpose that the Church traditionally thought it could.
First time I killed somebody, it was such a rush, and it was just like that shot of dope. Every time I did it, it was that rush again, and I started chasing that high.
I could shoot her facing her. Like I said before, I thought it would have to be from her back, and in order for me to aim at her back, she had to be facing away from me. If she reads for me, she sits down at the desk and reads a book, she will have her back to me. I had decided before that the first bite would be the buttocks. I was able to cut through the skin. I'm a fool, so I didn't have a clue about human body structure. I thought that red flesh would appear straight away, but it wasn't like that. And this layer that was like sweet corn just carried on for ages, however deep I cut through. I couldn't reach with my knife, so I ripped out the flesh with my fingers and put it in my mouth.
Hello, my name is Bishop Frank Duane. I'm the Bishop of the Diocese of Venice in Florida. I renew the appeal I made for a consensus to end the death penalty, which is both cruel and unnecessary.
I was born 1961. I'm computer engineer from Rothenburg, Germany. I killed a man, slaughtered him and ate him. Since then, he is always with me.
Around 6:15 or 6:30 in the evening, he said, "I can't stand it anymore. Cut it off." The second time it happened relatively quickly. It only took a couple of seconds to cut it a few times. Then he gave the most awful yell, but not for long, only around 20 to 30 seconds. Ow, ow, ow. Then he said, "All I can see is blackness." I have to sit down. A few seconds later, he told me that it didn't hurt anymore. He was astonished, because he'd hoped for more pain. He said to me, "Cut it in half." I asked myself whether I should pray to the devil or God. And I asked God for forgiveness. Then I took the knife, grasped it in my hand, and after hesitating some more, I cut his throat with it.
Yesterday, I signed the Catholic Mobilizing Network's National Catholic Pledge to end the death penalty.
After you killed her, you went back later to see the body. Is that right?
No, I went back to clean up.
She was found with her head removed. That's
right.
How did that happen?
Easy, just pick it up and move it.
What, you just pull the head off?
Yeah, it was already off.
Hello, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about how we really don't take into account the gravity of murder. I understand that generally people know that murder is evil and wrong. Thankfully, the majority of Americans still believe in the death penalty for our most egregious criminals, although that support is dwindling as the decades go on. I believe about 60% of Americans, in the last poll that I saw, 60% of Americans still support the death penalty, but that is a smaller number than what it was just decades ago, within recent decades. But my fear is that our society, our world, is more and more becoming callous to the reality of evil. We are becoming not only callous, but we are becoming more and more tolerant and more desensitized to this dark reality. One indication for this, in my view, are all of the YouTube comments that anyone can see on any YouTube video of an interview with a serial killer. Read the comments. It is full of people who will say things like, "Oh, look at this serial killer. He's such a genius. Oh, look, he's so articulate. Oh, look, he's so well-spoken, so soft-spoken. So hard to believe that this guy is a murderer." And looking at these comments, you can see why people get murdered by serial killers, because their guards are down when they are interacting with these bloodthirsty people. And that's why serial killers are, that's why they are able to kill, because they can get people's guards down. That's what makes them so dangerous. But yet people will see that ability to smokescreen their motives as genius, as intelligence, as something almost impressive. Another example of this is the huge popularity and the immense industry for books, movies, and documentaries about serial killers and mass murderers. Walk into any Barnes & Noble. There are always going to be huge sections just dedicated to true crime and serial killers. And just recently, they made a film about Jeffrey Dahmer. I forgot the name of it. And they also made a film recently about Ted Bundy. I have not watched these movies because I don't like looking at films that really make celebrities out of people who are famous for killing innocent people and doing horrific things like cannibalism. But these are examples of how the world is becoming more and more callous to the reality of evil to extremely evil people like serial killers. And they are people in the justice system, and they are activists. They are people in even in the Christian world, even in the Catholic Church or in the Episcopalian Church or the Lutheran Church, who have nothing but sympathy for people who rape and murder children, rape and murder women, and kill innocent people, and do horrific things like cannibalism and necrophilia. They are people in the Catholic world who walk around with a cross, and they walk around with all of the religious trappings, and they go around talking about how they believe in compassion. And their compassion, and I use that word loosely, is for some crazy and oddball reason dedicated to nobody but mass murderers. They are Catholics who have dedicated their lives to ending the death penalty because they have invested all of their feigned compassion to mass murderers. And it's amazing. It's amazing that if we were to see an imam talking about some Muslim terrorist in prison and saying, oh, look, our brothers are in prison, we must pray for them and we must support them because they are the warriors of the jihad and we demand that they be released. If we were to see an imam speaking with such rhetoric, we would have no qualms with calling that imam a terrorist, or at least a terrorist supporter or sympathizer. But for some reason, when we see a Catholic priest or a Catholic bishop or a nun who looks like she just came from Berkeley or San Francisco talking about compassion and sympathy for people who rape and murder children, people who cannibalize others, people who rape and murder women, we would say, oh, look, that person, if we don't agree with this person, we would say something like, oh, that person is wrong, or he or she is misguided, or they have a false view of Christian compassion. But we would never say, or there are people who would say that these religious clergy members are wonderful people, full of love. But no one will ever say that those clergy members, those nuns, those priests, those bishops are terrorists or are at least sympathetic to people who terrorize society, because that's what serial killers are. Serial killers are terrorizers. They terrorize society. Dennis Rader terrorized his community in Wichita when he was doing all of the horrific things that he was doing. Ted Bundy terrorized people. And then there was, what was his name? Danny Rawling. He terrorized people. He terrorized an entire university community when he was going around into random women's dorms and raping and murdering them. These people are terrorizers. And yet when we see religious clergy members, nuns and priests and bishops, people of God, when we see those people expressing nothing but sympathy for these murderers on death row, we never say these clergy members are terrorist sympathizers, terrorizer sympathizers. We would never say that. But that's what these people are. These clergy members are terrorist sympathizers, terrorist supporters. That's what they are. Now, of course, people will say, oh, they're not terrorists because terrorists kill for ideology. Okay, well, we can at least say that they are sympathetic to mass murderers, right? They're sympathizers for mass murderers. We can put it in that way. But I was looking through Robert Blecker's book today. I'm almost done with this book. I got about 90 or so pages to go. This has been a very good read. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. Very accessible book, easy to read, easy to understand. Even though Blecker is a man who was he was a special prosecutor, he's educated in law, he's a professor of law in New York City, he still does not impose the reader with his with his intellectual prowess and all the knowledge that he has on the law. He makes the law easy to understand, which is great because it is a complicated subject. But Blecker talks about a man, if you want to call him that, who raped and murdered women in the states of Connecticut and New York. His name was Michael Ross. Michael Ross raped and murdered women, girls, from the ages between 14 and 25. According to Wikipedia, he raped 7 out of his 8 murder victims. He was, to put it in a simple way, he was extremely evil. But there was a major judge who believed that Michael Ross should not be put on death row. In fact, he even went so far as to say that Michael Ross should have never been convicted in the first place because he had a disorder. What disorder was that, you ask? According to the judge, it was the disorder of sexual sadism. Yes, that is a disorder. If you take pleasure in sexually torturing people, you're not evil. You're not wicked, you're not sinister, you're not diabolical, you're not any of those things. It's not your fault because you have a disorder. You see, you have a disorder. You have a disorder. It's called sexual sadism. It's a disorder, according to some textbook. So it's not your fault. And this is yet again another example of how the world has become more and more callous to the reality of evil. We don't call things evil. We don't call things that are truly evil, evil. We slap a scientific name on it, and we use it as an excuse to exempt murderers and to exempt sinister people. So, according to Robert Blecker, it says here that Ross had murdered 8 young women, including 2 teenagers. The prosecutors who sought his death felt certain. The jurors who unanimously sentenced him to die felt certain. The courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, concurred that this mass-murdering rapist could constitutionally receive society's ultimate sanction, which is capital punishment. But 11 hours before this sadistic serial killer would finally get his due, one man, U.S. District Court Judge Robert N. Chatigny, stopped it. And this is what this judge, Chatigny, had to say. He said, quote, "He, Ross, never should have been convicted. Or if convicted, he never should have been sentenced to death because his sexual sadism is clearly a mitigating factor." Now, I looked into this Judge Chatigny, and I found out that he supports men who think they're women to be allowed to compete in sports with female opponents. Yeah. So this guy is a psychopath. It reminds me of that book. If any of you guys are Michael Savage fans, you'll know what I'm talking about. Michael Savage wrote a book many years ago, called Liberalism as a Mental Disorder. And I have a copy of that book, actually. It's a very entertaining book. I used to listen to Michael Savage every single day, especially after school. First thing, you get in the car, you turn on Michael Savage, you listen to Michael Savage. And years later, when I stopped listening to him on the AM radio, I would go online and I would listen to him live on the internet, or I would just watch his latest episode on YouTube. And I loved listening to him. And he wrote a book called Liberalism is a Mental Disorder. And the book, the book's title is self-explanatory as to what the book was about. It was about liberalism being for crazy people. And if you look at this Judge Chatigny, you can see how Michael Savage's words are quite accurate, actually. I mean, this judge attests to what Michael Savage said, and he is a living embodiment for what Michael Savage was warning us about. It's a mental disorder. Chatigny went on to say that Michael Ross may be the least culpable meaning guilty, the least of the people on death row because he has a disorder. The only person who has a disorder here is the judge. I mean, I say that with humor, but the reality is that Judge Chatigny is a very evil person. And then he says, Blecker explains that Judge Chatigny proclaimed, hold on, next line, if Ross picked up his appeals and returned to death row, quote, and these are the words of the judge, he would be the subject of ridicule. He is effectively boxed in now. Oh, poor mass murderer rapist is boxed in, and we have to feel sorry for him. You see, this is the essence of evil. For many years of my life, I have pondered on the nature of evil. Some people have warned me that I get a little too deep into these subjects. I remember my first speaking engagement, or one of my first speaking engagements, was speaking to young college students, Christian college students, in, I think it was in Pennsylvania or in New Jersey, one of those East Coast states. And there was a young man who got very upset with me after my talk. And this was one of my first talks. This is before, well, was it before I got into YouTube? I think so. But he was kind of upset with me. And he said that I focus more on the devil than I do God. Now, that's not true. But what I will say is that the understanding of evil actually gives us a better understanding of God. And what I mean by that is the very existence of evil and the very existence of man's choice to do evil is an attestment to man's free will to choose good and to therefore choose God. A great manifestation of this phenomena is the Spanish conquest of the New World. When the Spanish came to Mexico, they witnessed the horrific, violent, diabolical religion of the Aztecs. They saw people being ritualistically murdered on the Aztec pyramids. Men were having their hearts plucked out by the thousands within a day, actually. On one pyramid, they would murder around 2,000 people as ritualistic sacrifices. And that was just on one pyramid. They had many pyramids on which they would have thousands of sacrifices occurring at the same time, simultaneously, within the same day. It was pretty horrific. And the Spanish were so disturbed by this that they burned a lot of the architecture, the pagan architecture. They destroyed a lot of the idols. They destroyed a lot of the pyramids. And they brought Christianity to the land. So you can see in this one historical example the distinct difference between light and darkness, and how, in this case, light triumphed over darkness. So by understanding darkness, we have a better appreciation and a better awareness of the light. Because I noticed that many times when we belittle the reality of evil, we tend to become indifferent to the light. And so in that state of mind, we don't even know that we're in darkness because we become so indifferent to it all. And in that state of mind, it would be pretty easy for one to be taken advantage of by the darkness. And so that's why I study what I study. Now, I remember years ago, I dropped my pen. It's kind of agitating me, actually. I remember years ago when I was maybe, how old was I? Maybe 12 years old, 13 years old. I went to Cancun, Mexico, and I went to the pyramids. I saw the Aztec pyramid of Chichen Itza. And Chichen Itza, it's one of the last remaining pyramids that the Spanish did not destroy in Mexico. And if you ever see this pyramid, it's huge. It's ginormous. And it takes about an hour for somebody to climb up this pyramid. There are steps, and these steps have lasted the test of time. But it's difficult to walk up the stairs because the steps are so small. And the reason why they're so small, because usually when you walk up, well, always in the modern world, when you walk up a staircase, the steps are big enough for your feet, and that makes it easy to climb up or easy to walk up a set of stairs. In this case, on the Pyramid of Chichen Itza, the steps were tiny, much tinier than a human foot. And I'm size 13. I got size 13 shoes on. At that time, I think I had maybe size 12. And I mean, I couldn't walk up this set of stairs. I literally was crawling up the stairs. And the reason why they designed the steps so small is because when they murdered somebody in their diabolical rituals, they would just drop the body down the stairs. And the steps were so small that the body would just roll down the stairs, and it made it easier to dispose of the corpses of those that they ritualistically butchered. And there was a tourist guide there, and I asked him about the human sacrifices. And he said, "Oh, no, it wasn't that bad. Actually, maybe they kill like one person a year, for their This is how Mexican culture is. They kill maybe one person a year for the sacrifices. In fact, this was a very wonderful, extremely sophisticated and advanced civilization, and sadly, it was destroyed by the Spaniards. This is like going to Auschwitz and going to the concentration camp of Auschwitz, and the tour guide telling you that this was a wonderful German civilization, and it was so great until the Americans came and ruined it all. It's literally the equivalent to that, because the Aztecs were a genocidal, diabolical civilization that needed to be destroyed, just like the Third Reich needed to be destroyed. I know this is to the ire of many trad Catholics who fanboy over Adolf Hitler. But when people look to the Aztecs and say, oh, they had a wonderful civilization, regardless of all the cannibalism and flailing human flesh and wearing the flesh as a dress like in Silence of the Lambs and ritualistic murder, regardless of all that, they were a wonderful civilization. The fact that people even talk this way shows an indifference and a callousness to the reality of evil. And when you develop this indifference or callousness, you get sucked into the evil. It sucks you in, and you don't even know it. And one thing I've noticed is that part of the nature of evil is the phenomena of being the victim while victimizing others. This is one thing that I've noticed over the years. If you look at, for example, the Aztec civilization, it victimized tens of thousands of people, even hundreds of thousands, actually, if you consider how they enslaved and butchered their neighbors. And when the Spanish came, they were the victim all of a sudden. They didn't want to die. And then after they were destroyed, they still play the victim. Their sympathizers like to play the victim. Their sympathizers love to project this victimhood upon the Aztecs. Well, they weren't victims. They were a belligerent in a war, and they lost, thankfully so. We see this with people who sympathize with the Nazis. The Nazis were victimizers who butchered millions of people, and they became the victims when the Americans and the Allies bombed the shit out of them. Rightfully so. But they became the victims, and they didn't like that. And to this day, you have old German historians who will tell you about how much they were victims in that war. I remember reading this book about the genocide of the Polish people by the Third Reich. It was called Poland's Holocaust. I've done a good number of videos on that book on this channel. It was written by, what was his name? Petrovsky. I forgot his name. But anyway, it's called Poland's Holocaust. It's a great book, very detailed. And what I liked about the book is that there's a lot of extensive quotes from people who actually survived under the Third Reich's reign of terror. There was this one account that he puts in which a guy, a Polish man, saw just a giant pile of dead bodies. And he watched from a distance, and he saw a German officer, SS officer, walking around, observing the bodies, and then he saw an infant in the pile of bodies that was still alive. He picks up the infant, grabs the infant by the legs, and literally splits the infant in half with his own hands. To sit there and tell me that the Third Reich was this amazing civilization, or they were very, the Nazis were super intelligent people, that really is a way to smokescreen the reality of how evil the Third Reich was. But again, this is the world that we are heading towards. The Mongolian Empire was by far one of the most, if not the most, genocidal empire in history. It was definitely a machine of mass rape. Definitely not an empire that we should look to as as an exemplary for good. But if you read any sort of modern day book on the Mongols, or the Huns for that matter, you will be reading a book that glorifies them or expresses admiration for these empires. You can see the same thing in books on the Ottoman Empire. And in fact, you will have modern day history books that will not completely ignore the reality of the Armenian genocide done by the Ottomans, but they will sort of pay lip service to it and then just gesture it away. Looking at this phenomena, I can see that we are heading towards a different world. It's not the world of the post-World War II era. It's a new world that we're heading towards, in which evils that were done within the modern era, the French Revolution, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, these things are slowly becoming more and more left to the side and given in different ears, and really doesn't really have the interest of most people anymore. Most people don't even care about these subjects anymore. Just look at the fact, look at the reality of Holocaust films. They were something that were very popular in the 1990s, early 90s, 1980s, but it's no longer even something that people want to watch anymore. I remember in 2019, I went to Italy and I saw the Colosseum. I went to the Colosseum, and it was an amazing place. I mean, it was huge. The Colosseum is a lot bigger in real life than it is just looking at photographs of it. And my dad and I we went up to this top part of the arena, and we just sat down on stone. They had these big stone seats that you could sit on. And we were just kind of laughing as we were looking at all the people in the Colosseum, all the tourists. I have never in my life seen so many women doing selfies in one place ever. It was the Colosseum and the Vatican. Those two places, I have seen more women in front of me doing selfies than at any other point of my life. It was crazy. Like every time you see all these women with the sticks, the selfie sticks, and they're just taking pictures of themselves constantly. It was kind of surreal. Kind of reminds me of that song by Seether, Teenage Wasteland. It's a great song. So I was in the Colosseum, and you have people talking about, oh, this, it was built at this date, and they made new additions to it on this date, and it was built by this, and this emperor did this, and blah, 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 blah. But there was no talk about the fact that this was a death camp. It was a killing field. There was no talk about that. I read a book years ago. In fact, you can see it right here. This book here, Rome. That was it? Yeah. Wait, was it this book? Pretty certain it was this book. But anyway, I read years ago that the Colosseum had the highest concentration of killing in that much of a space than in any other area of the world. That area. They calculate that around 500,000 or so people were butchered in the Colosseum. The Colosseum has the highest, what was an area of that space that had the highest concentration of killing, more so than any other spot comparable to that size on Earth. And yet people go to the Colosseum as if it's this wonderful tourist attraction. It's a killing field. That's what it was. The Colosseum was a killing field. And I remember just sitting there just laughing about the fact that people come into this place, completely indifferent to what this place was. This was a killing field, just like the pyramids in Mexico were places of killing, just like the concentration camps were places of mass murder. We have become indifferent to the reality of evil. Bottom line. Anyway, that's my thoughts for tonight. Hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys have learned something. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.